Guys, welcome to the first of the panel debates on Europe and large carnivores. So we're going to have a fairly simple kind of format today. I'm going to give a very brief introduction just to set the big scene. Then we're going to bring the five kind of panel members up on the stage. And we're going to go through an exercise where I have some questions just to stimulate a conversation. And then we're going to go through questions, but hopefully it'll become more organic and not just like a question-answer session. So hopefully they will be interacting with each other, and the audience are free at any time to ask questions or comment, because really the goal is to have a nice kind of organic, lively discussion here, because we're not really, no one is presenting answers. We're all in a process of trying to understand what this kind of coexistence idea is. And we're only going to get there, I think, through an awful lot of interaction and discussion and deliberation. So just to get things started, the news from kind of Europe is that the wolf is back, right? It's a time to be careful, kind of lock up your daughters and your sheep at night because the wolf has returned. And the wolf is not back by itself, but the wolf has also brought some friends along. Right, so like in a European context, we're talking about four large carnivores, right? The wolf, the brown bear, the Eurasian lynx, and the wolverine. That slightly obscure carnivore, which probably nobody in the room has ever heard of. The key point, though, I think, of this whole session is that we're not talking about a conservation context of doom and gloom and decline and saving things from extinction. That would have been, if we had been here, say, in 1970, that would very much have been the discourse here. It would be, how do we save these animals from extinction? And that's the discourse probably being held in lots of the other lecture halls today and tomorrow and Saturday, where people really are dealing with species suffering declines and facing the edge of extinction. We're not there. In 2023, we're kind of lucky in a way that we're standing here talking about what happens when conservation actually succeeds. And ironically, as I think what we're probably going to find out, is that working out how to live with success is probably a lot more challenging than how to actually make it happen at the start. Because we certainly have many challenges living with a conservation success. Just to kind of illustrate how that success looks, this is a map of wolf arm distribution. The one on the left is like circa 1950, the kind of low point of kind of European wolves. And the map on the right is from around 2016. And really it shows that an awful lot of those white spaces on the map are now no longer white. The wolf is back. And it's back in the strangest of places. You know, Germany has well over 1,000 wolves today. You know, Denmark has breeding wolves. The Dutch have breeding wolves. You know, every European country, apart from the Vatican, has had a wolf passing through. And in the case of the Vatican, there may well be some wolves in residence there, in sheep's clothing. So basically, everybody is having to deal with the return of the wolf. And today, we probably have around 19,000 wolves living in Europe. This is not something on the edge of extinction. And the trend in just about every population is increasing and stable. If we kind of look at bears, you don't see the same dramatic distribution change, because bears do everything slower. But certainly the distributions have expanded and densities have increased. So today we have maybe 17,000 bears. Most of the populations are big and stable and doing well. But even though we should point out there are some bear populations which are quite small and threatened. So the picture is not only good, but overwhelmingly the big picture for bears is good. And for both, and wolves have come back entirely through natural expansion. The bears have been assisted by a couple of kind of reintroductions. If we look at lynx, again, you had the same picture of expansion, especially in Central Europe. And here it's largely been aided by kind of reintroduction. There have been many different kind of reintroduction projects, many are still ongoing. But we're still talking about a sum of around 9,000 lynx on a continental basis. Some small populations, some big ones. But again, this is not a species facing the edge of extinction. Right? So all three things here the trends are pretty good in the big picture. So for the conservationists, people can say this is a success story, and we need these, right? The conservation is infiltrated with doom and gloom, and we really need these good stories where things actually do well. Policy works. But it's not only a conservation success story. The return of carnivores is very much linked to the rise of many conflicts. And these conflicts are diverse, right? It's the old familiar stories of livestock depredation that we all hear. Certainly a strong competition with hunters in some places. Hunting dogs are being killed. We have a fear for safety, maybe not justified in terms of numbers, but people do die. Bears do kill people. Wolves do occasionally bite people. So the risk is certainly there, even if it's much lower than if you're talking about elephants and lions. But mainly in a European context, we're managing these social conflicts. And there's conflicts between different groups of people about conservation or about the way of doing conservation. And these conflicts in Europe are dramatic. They really are political issues on national and European levels. So the question which we have to work on, and which hopefully the panelists and the audience will shed some light on today, is how do we sustain this conservation success? In 50 years, we turned it around from decline to expansion and kind of recovery. We have wolves in places where we didn't even dream, even in our most optimistic moments back in the 90s, that wolves would actually live there and breed there. But how do we sustain this? How do we ensure that the pendulum doesn't swing backwards and things head into decline? So, to begin exploring this, we have our panel. Our first panelist will be Luigi Butani. Luigi, if you can come up, who is chairman of the Large Carnivore Initiative for Europe, which is an IUCN specialist group. We also have Camilla Sandström, a professor in political science, hopefully, right, in Umeå University in Sweden. Sabrina Dietz is the Wildlife Policy Officer for the European Federation for Hunting and Conservation. We have Alexander Treiche from, I've been trying to pronounce that name for 20 years, who is the executive director, nonetheless, of an NGO from Albania. It's very important being an executive director. Hello? Yes, and finally, we have Hannes Koenig, who is only a director, not an executive director. Or have you changed? Officer. An officer, pardon me, in the German Federal Center for Grazing, Livestock and Wolf. So between them, these panelists span the European continent. We have the Balkans, we have Central Europe, we have Scandinavia in here, we have people working on different species and different topics, some ecologists, some social scientists, some NGO people, and some government officials. So in a way, it's a nice, diverse group of people who hopefully will bring both a local perspective and a wider European view to this debate. So guys, just to get you warmed up, right, and so the audience get a bit of a feel for you, we have the first question. And this is, what was your last encounter with a large carnivore? Luigi, you can start on this one.
You mean a physical encounter?
Physical, metaphysical, whatever.
Okay. 2 nights ago at my house, I was sleeping, and at midnight I was awoke by a howl of a wolf pack. They live 300 meters from my house in Tuscany, close to Siena. So I'm pretty lucky, blessed by this coexistence of with a pack of wolves. Quite close.
You forgot the part about your dog.
Well, I'm actually nervous about that because I have a fence, but it was a fence not made for wolves. It was made for wild boars, so it's just like that. And if wolves wanted to jump over, they could easily jump and grab my dog. So I try not to leave the dog out when it's dark, and I take some precaution, but I am aware that it could happen. And if it would happen, I would cry, but that's life.
Okay, thank you. So Camilla, what was your last encounter?
Yeah, sorry for my voice. Leaving in the mountains in Sweden, leaving from the mountains in Sweden in -30, coming here in +8, it was not very good, killing my voice. But I'll try to do a talk anyway. I saw wolverine tracks this weekend when I was out skiing, but we've also had the lynx hunt recently in Sweden, so I've seen also some lynx dead because the hunt was quite successful as planned. But I've also seen the carcass from a roe deer back just behind our house that was taken by one of these lynxes. So.
Okay, Sabrina.
Yes, well, I actually had a very nice encounter with the lynx. 2 weeks ago, I visited the Live Lynx project in Slovenia. So it was a lynx that was captured in Slovakia and brought to Slovenia to reinforce the lynx population in the Slovenian Alps. And I think I want to highlight the project because it's truly a hunter's project. 50 years ago, it was the hunters of Slovenia that brought back the first lynx to Slovenia, and still now they are very engaged, they are very passionate about purely lynx conservation. They take care of the lynx in the soft release enclosure, and they do the monitoring. They even educate the local police forces to spot more easily incidences of illegal killing. So it's really the hunters in Slovenia driving the conservation, and they're very proud, and they want the lynx in their hunting ground. They are fighting on where the lynx should be released. So I think this is one of the good news stories where hunters are involved.
There's actually a really nice video on YouTube, actually, where they interviewed some of these hunters from the 1970s, talking about their initial motivation to bring lynx back into the hunting grounds, back into the former Yugoslavia. So it's a really nice interview. And since then they died, the old guys. So someone got a camera in front of them just in time to record the stories of that really early conservation. But like, just to underline this goes back to 1972. Right? This was before conservation biology textbooks existed, before people spoke much about conservation. But these projects, like in Switzerland, Slovenia, these early reintroductions were happening 50 years ago. So we're dealing with the legacy of a process that started well before people actually invented modern-day conservation science, which I think is quite interesting just to get that temporal perspective on things. So it's a good example that you brought it up. Alex, please.
Yeah, so my last encounter was probably not very exciting, or at least not in our line of work, finding some bear tracks while doing surveying outside, but an impressive encounter recently that I've had and has also remained a bit engraved in my mind was actually hearing the howling of jackals, which I thought we have established they're considered large carnivores for Europe. And it was in a setting where there was a huge power station making a lot of noise. There was a massive highway nearby where cars were going, 100 kilometers an hour. So a lot of human disturbance around. And then you hear this howling in the middle of all that, just 50, 60 meters away from you. And then you are amazed, how do they manage to survive in all what we consider is human chaos induced to their way of living. But they do, and they are thriving very well in those circumstances.
Cool. Hannes?
Yeah, quite interesting. Well, I come from an area in eastern Germany, Brandenburg state, where wolves returned in 2002, and now we have some 350, 400 wolves only in this state. And total of Germany, maybe 1,200 roughly. And I work for the German Federal Center for Grazing, Livestock and Wolf, and my daily work is related to collaborate with farmers associations, and also with representatives of the federal state authorities. So also those who are in the extension service supporting livestock keepers to set up fences and organizing subsidies and compensation programs, but also to monitor damages. And next to the forest where I live with my family, wolves are around. I have them frequently on the camera traps, and I can track them. And wolves have also visited the farms next to us. I've seen quite some killed livestock and talked to the farmers. And what unifies us also is conservation, because at first we were quite happy and optimistic that nature's healing, but we face the reality quite soon, and now try to solve challenges and find solutions together with conservation and farmers, how to minimize conflicts, which are obviously there every day. And so encounters are trans and interdisciplinary for me, working with people, but also trying to work with livestock and wolf behavior and see how to make coexistence happen. And this is what I really like to explore with you and to jointly find solutions.
Good. Thank you. So just that basically establishes, I think, that just in everyday life, carnivores are now back. You know, and even, yeah, we actually bump into carnivores in our day-to-day work and lives, and not so much our professional lives. No one really mentioned a professional encounter here. Well, you did, but otherwise these are all accidental encounters in daily life. So you don't have to be like an Indiana Jones kind of biologist in the wilderness to encounter a European carnivore. You get it at home when you're sleeping at night, you get it at home skiing, or whatever. So they are back, living around us. So moving on to the next question. How would you describe the current state of the relationship between large carnivores and Europeans at the moment? Very shortly, how would you summarize it? Like, not so much like one word, but let's give you, say, you know, a short sentence or two. So let's start in the middle, Louis. You're anxious to get going here.
No, I think it's a wrong question, because
I take that personal.
there is no way of defining one relationship. There are 6 species of large carnivores. There are 28 more in Europe, not counting European Union only. About 30 countries in Europe, a lot of different geographic, social, ecological, economic situations, so the relationship changes. Actually, there is not one relationship. And so we have, I think we have the whole range from total acceptance to total rejection. Everything in between.
And we probably represent those 2 extremes of our living conditions when it comes to the wolf, I guess. Camilla.
Yeah, well, looking into our measurement of it, we can see that the existence value is very high. There's a lot of people that would like to have wolves in Sweden or in Europe. But as soon as we start to ask when these animals come close to you, the attitudes change. And that also highlights the need for policymakers and decision makers to actually take action to also increase the trust in authorities, for example, but also in the measurements or the decisions that are made, so that people can rely on that, okay, if I say yes to have these large carnivores, I also would like a package of decisions that, or policies that actually mitigate or make it possible to live close to these animals. And also to know what to do when you have conflicts. And that's been largely missing, I would say, in many countries. So there's a lot of things to do to increase that job.
Okay. Sabrina?
Yes, I think I can fully agree with Luigi, and even within the hunting community, I mean, I'm representing the hunting community today, there is no one attitude towards large carnivores. It's not black and white, and I think the example of the Slovenian project is quite interesting, because in fact we had also representatives from the Swedish hunters in Slovenia, and they said, okay, the hunters in Slovenia, they are crazy. I mean, and then the other way around, that hunters in Slovenia was like, okay, we cannot imagine to hunt lynx at the moment. But I think it shows quite well that different approaches towards large carnivore management can still work. I mean, there was lynx hunting going on in Sweden, and it's going on for several years now. But the population is doing well, it's increasing, and it's stable most likely. And then in Slovenia, of course, the lynx population is the hunters are the ones that support the spread of the lynx. Then there are some hunters that are not interested at all in large carnivore management. And the hunters in France, they say, okay, let the government deal with large carnivore management. It's way too hot species for us. We are happy if the government is doing the wolf management for us. So there are many different opinions also on how large carnivore management looks like in different countries, even within the hunting community.
Okay. I'm starting to see why BBC don't ever make a documentary about large carnivores, because the answers always, it's difficult and it's complicated. There is no soundbite here. Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with what was shared earlier by the panelists. What we often think, well, what I've noticed that sometimes Europe is thought after as, you know, being part of the global north and having that particular set of characteristics on how the global north deals with wildlife and wildlife management and what they try to introduce in other places. But we often forget that there is a regional south in this global north, and even within Europe there is a huge variation. I mean, going, as it was said earlier, going from total acceptance and what could be defined as the closest thing that we can imagine on how a coexistence looks like, also known as Albanian highlands, sorry, or, you know, total situation of total conflict. And one of the things that has impressed me when I started working at the organization, I remember back then there was this huge story about this bear that made it into Germany, and it was all over the media. I think it was 2005 or 2006, and it was like the first bear that made it to Germany after 100-something years. And as an Albanian...
name. It was Bruno.
Bruno, yeah, Bruno.
It's known for every German.
Yeah, so Bruno, exactly. So to me what was impressive was the media hype around it, on, you know, how you'd open, you know, any European news outlet, and there would be the story about Bruno. And coming from a country where, you know, there are hundreds of bears in the countryside, and you hardly see any article about bears. So they do cause a lot of trouble, they do cause damages, they, you know, they kill livestock and so on. And that was quite a big realization that there is a huge difference within the continent on how we deal with large carnivores from very early on for me. And yeah, that's something.
Bruno was kind of the Cecil of Europe, I guess, in his time. So, Hannes? The current temperature?
Yes, well, the relationship of people and Europeans towards carnivores, well, I focused very much on wolves, and I think there's a period of transition, not only for those who were happy for having wolves back in Germany, but also for all stakeholders who deal with the return of wolves. Success story for conservation. My question was always who pays the bill, and working with farmers, I think it's very important also this morning. It was said, listen to the people. And I'm aware that hunters have their important stakeholders, but they don't pay the bill in direct terms. They have an interest in game and hunting. So it's more an economic aspect, but for farmers, for livestock keepers, they go to the meadow in the morning, to the pasture, and see killed animals. And because laws and regulations are quite successful and strict, Habitat Directive, we now have to trust and to kind of see how we can make a smooth transformation from a time where there was no wolf to a time where there's wolf. And all this determines the relationship of people from the ground to policymakers about the relationship. And I think it's very important to focus from a social lens to the stakeholders who are affected or those who have the power to influence decisions. And this with care, I think science can do quite some evidence-based support to see what are the needs and what are the relational values and how can we bring this together in this time of transformation. And at some point we will have the situation like in Albania where people are used to it and live with bears and maybe smile if they hear about Bruno, one bear entering the media. But also when looking at the Netherlands, Hugh Jansman is sitting here, Laura de Kort from Belgium, they experience similar stories we had when the first wolves came back to Germany. There was a mass of media presence, and at least in Brandenburg state this has lowered down, but where the edge at the front of the migration towards the south of Germany or the Netherlands, media, it's a phenomenon. People are excited and they have fear. They have a different relationship. Also, if you look at the gradient between the urban, rural sides, the urban people, they don't pay the bill, but it's the rural people who keep livestock. And I think this determines also the relationship.
So basically, diversity and change are the summaries here. And kind of diversity on short gradients and long gradients and change over time. Like, it's interesting that the first wolf reproduction in Germany was 99, 2000? 2000, right? And today we're up to 1,200 wolves plus, plus, plus. That is very rapid change. You know, it's sort of, these things don't wait. So things are happening fast. Luigi, you had a comment?
No, just add a comment after hearing the other presentation is the relationship changes depending on the group of interest, of course, and that poses a question for democracies, actually, because if you poll the attitude at national level, you get an overwhelming support for carnivores because the majority of Europeans live in cities and they don't see carnivores at all. It's like asking whether you want to save the tigers in India. Of course you want to save it. It's in India, far away. But then, you know, if you ask the people at local level, it depends on the stakeholders, I will say. You know, it depends if you ask hunters or farmers, and in certain areas depends which kind of farmers, you know. And sometimes you find certain farmers who are in favor, others are against, and so the relationship is very, very complex. And I see the difficulty of managing this diversity. If you are a manager, even if you are a politician, and you can see the reaction, you know, across Europe. I mean, Austria has taken a stand against, I mean, formally at government level. Switzerland has asked the Berne Convention to change the status of wolves, even though they are I mean, the damage done by wolves in Switzerland is actually nothing compared to the rest of, you know, let's say Italy or France or whatever. So the relationship is really difficult and has to be approached at local level. But how local? Not too local. I guess we will come to that later on.
Ahead. You've gone straight to question 7. Like, you jumped over questions 3, 4, 5, and 6.
I'll shut up.
He's very eager to get there. Is this about this question 7 that's coming, or something else? Can that wait till we get to the end? Because that's kind of coming. There's a logical progression here. Okay, good. Serena?
Yeah, if I can add on, I mean, FACE is working very much on a more political level, and you mentioned Austria, and I think Austria is also very interesting because yes, the agriculture ministry, they took a stand, they want more active wolf management, but then at the same time the environmental ministry wrote a letter with other member states to the European Commission to keep the high protection up. So we see even within member states, the different ministries have opposing positions, and then it's very difficult sometimes to find a way forward.
Yep. Politics is certainly there, but we are going to end up there at the end. So, the next question. We've had a bit of the past and the present. Now, just speculate a bit. Look into your little crystal balls and come with a prediction for the future. You know, look into that little ball and look in the fog, and how do you think the future for large carnivores is actually going to be? Are you pessimistic? Are you optimistic? What are you? Let's start at this end for a change.
Well, I think it's quite positive compared to a time where they were regionally eradicated for several factors. The Habitat Directive, European and national laws won't allow another eradication of a species. Second, we have, as it is the case of wolves, a generalist who adapts very well to multi-use, intensive agricultural landscapes where there's a lot of prey. One has to say in Germany we have one of the highest density of roe deer and wild boar in Europe, and that's one of the key factors driving this vast development of the return of wolves. That's one reason why I think I see a positive future on the one hand. On the other hand, again, we have this time of transformation, and at some point, I don't know the year exactly, but maybe in 10 years, when whole Central Europe will be remigrated or occupied, or when wolves are everywhere, there will be a balance. I think. I don't believe so much in trophic cascade effects because we have a highly manipulated ecosystem, and those problems that occur with livestock farmers also face a time of structural changes and demographic changes. Farmers who are really willing and have the ability to cope with the challenges ahead with support of government and conservation and reorientation, because they have been disconnected for generations, maybe 100, 150, 200 years. That's also different to those regions where people used to coexist and live with large carnivores. And there's a different level of technical development and change. So farmers are not often 24 hours with their livestock in the field, but they have guarding dogs or fences. But I think there will take a process also in this transition, how to reorganize keeping livestock, grazing livestock, with the presence of wolves, because I believe they won't get eradicated, and it doesn't matter if there are 100 or 1,000 wolves. At the end, one has to successfully implement effective damage prevention interventions, and this is where we have to give support and work.
Okay. Alex, the crystal ball, the future.
Yeah, I mean, the crystal ball, it's very hard to predict the future. And it's, as we talked earlier, the whole of Europe is very nuanced. So it might look very different in different regions and parts of Europe. From a regional perspective, in southeastern Europe, in the Balkans, the large carnivores have historically been doing well. So those populations have always been healthy. There have been people coexisting with large carnivores for millennia, basically. They never got extinct there. And in that respect, that has created situations where, you know, people can coexist very well with these large carnivores. They know that they are part of the natural environment. They know how to deal with them. They feel they have responsibility to protect their property, their livestock against attacks from large carnivores. But the dynamics that are happening, at least regionally, is that the region is developing quite rapidly. And we are now facing massive increase in infrastructure. There are highways being built all over the place. There are railways being built all over the place, much like the infrastructure development that happened in most of Central and Western Europe, perhaps decades, if not centuries ago. And that is posing quite a lot of threat for large carnivores. And that is also coupled with factors of massive depopulation of mountain areas. So people are really leaving these areas. They're either leaving to go and live in bigger cities or leaving to go abroad. Migration is a huge issue for Albania in particular, but the entire region, the Balkans, the Western Balkans in general. And the people that are leaving are very much the people that are from these, you know, remote communities living in the mountains. And all that tradition and all that know-how on how to live with large carnivores is also slowly disappearing with them. Nobody wants to be a shepherd anymore. You know, it's a dying profession. I mean, if you go out in the field in Albania, if you'd go out 30, 40 years ago, you'd see plenty of shepherds, both old and young, but now it's usually only old people who are still keeping the profession alive. I wouldn't even call it a profession. I think they consider it a livelihood. It's their way of living. I mean, so that's disappearing, and that's changing very, very rapidly. And together with it, we predict that there's going to be massive consequences for the large carnivore populations in the region as well. Many of these countries are also aspiring to be part of the European Union. And that poses some challenges in itself, because to become a member of the European Union, it means that you need to reach certain policy and legislation standards that allow you to be member of this community. And many of these countries have been blindly following those directives without taking very much in consideration the local aspect of what's happening with the people on the ground. So what that has often resulted is in overprotection of some species. So for instance, wolf might get legal protection, which is enforced, and its emphasis on being enforced. That makes a lot of people on the local level very angry, because if until yesterday they could shoot a wolf if the wolf was killing some of the sheep, today they cannot anymore, and that they feel that power that was residing in their hands being taken away from them, and that increases this situation of conflict and the perception that the wolf is associated with much larger mechanisms outside of the local domain.
Okay. Sabrina?
Yes, I think for hunters, how hunters see the future of large carnivores. I mean, first of all, I think within our membership, we agreed that we do support the conservation of large carnivores. But for conservation, there's a whole toolbox, and this toolbox was used in the past with strict protection, with other conservation measures, with better monitoring and so on. But we want really more flexibility and being more open-minded, and that maybe also at one point an active management is part of this conservation toolbox. So we want social acceptance, and this is social acceptance not of the people in the urban areas, it's social acceptance of the people that do need to live with the large carnivores. It's the farmers, it's the hunters, it's the rural communities in general. And we also want maybe a better degree of flexibility, because what we see currently on a European level, yes, all our large carnivore species, they are increasing, but at the same time, we see political movements to make protection stricter and stricter. Like in Finland, for example, there is a regulated management of bear or lynx going on, but now every derogation they use is almost ending up in front of the court. So they see that the populations are increasing, they see that the conflict is increasing, but then the way to manage is getting more and more limited. And we have a phase wolf position that was adopted by all our members, where we say, okay, maybe it is time to look at the protection status, to move it from strictly protected to protected, which still means that they are protected. The member states have the legal obligation to ensure that the species is not declining. But it gives member states and the regions a bit more flexibility in managing the large carnivores and managing the conflicts. But at the same time, we also agreed that, okay, if we see that large carnivores are doing worse, and we are all in favor then to put the strict protection back in place. This is what we agreed as European hunters for the wolf. So, I mean, it's not that hunters are crazy and want the eradication back of the large carnivores. We just need more flexibility.
Okay. So, Camilla?
Yeah, I totally agree with the euridification issue. That's one of the challenges. But I would also like to raise climate change as one issue in the future. And not just because of climate change, but all what is associated with climate change. And that links back to what you also raised, Alex, about the need to have fossil-free energy and the re-industrialization of our landscapes. Currently, in the northern parts of Sweden, and I don't know if you remember the maps, which were heavily green, from all the large carnivores. And that's also the areas where we are now transforming these areas from natural landscapes into productive landscapes or industrialized landscapes to get fossil-free energy from windmill parks, green steel and so forth. And that's of course going to be a challenge in order to, provide habitats for these large carnivores, but also, of course, create more conflicts because there's a high demand for land and the use of land for not only for the Swedish population, but to export energy, for example, to Europe and other parts, and also other products for the rest of the world. So that's definitely going to be a challenge. And without habitats, there's not going to be any large carnivores. So that's also something that needs to be considered in this, to see the whole picture of this issue. I think that one of the problems with the large carnivore issue is that the primary focus has been on the number of large carnivores, and that has not been related to the habitats and what kind of prey you actually have in the landscape. So, for example, in Sweden, we have always or often been accused of not having enough wolves, for example. But if you don't have enough prey or space for them, that's going to be a challenge in a highly industrialized landscape.
Luigi first, and then we can come back to Sabina.
Well, I would change the question
You really don't
again,
like, you really don't like my
and say
questions.
what the future of each of the 6 large carnivores, because it makes a big difference. You know, we will have jackals everywhere, even in the gardens of your houses, everywhere. That's for sure. For one, wolverine is a northern affair, so I'm not talking about that. Lynx and bears, they do need a certain habitat that we can define. And I'm not very optimistic about their fate across Europe. I mean, certain areas, sure, there will be room for that, but not everywhere. When we speak of wolves, I mean, I'm very optimistic. We will never get rid of them. And it is extremely difficult. And there is always habitat for wolves, because the habitat for a wolf is anywhere where there is anything to eat. I mean, really, anything, and where they are not shot. So a wolf was caught in downtown Milan a few months ago, and was caught, one was rescued downtown Verona a few weeks ago, just to mention, you know, the adaptability. So I'm very optimistic. We will never get rid of them, unless we will use a massive spread of poison baits, which is illegal everywhere in Europe and is actually relatively under control all over Europe. It will probably be easy to get rid of wolves in some of the northern countries, because if they hunt on snow, and then you can snow track these animals and eventually be very effective in killing them. Look at the speed with which in Sweden they got rid of 75 wolves, you know, just like that. They could have done 700 like that too. I'm rather optimistic that there will be room, even though it will be difficult to come up with some common policies and regional policies, species-specific policies, actually, in each country. That will be more difficult.
Thank you. Just an anecdote on the adaptability of the wolf. The first time I ever saw Luigi speaking at a conference was in 1989, when he was younger, I was younger, and he had this slide of this wolf standing outside a garbage dump, eating this mountain of spaghetti where somebody had dumped on this garbage dump. And it was this Italian wolf, you know, and like, the wolf in Italy, huh? What does it eat? It eats spaghetti, you know. It was brilliant. That was my first encounter with Luigi. On a comment on the comments.
Yes, just on Camilla's one, I think it's a very important one on the landscape productivity, which is so different when it comes to the prey base of the wolf, for example. I mean, wolves expanding and growing has a way more impact in Sweden, for example, than it has in Germany. And this also, of course, influences their attitude towards large carnivores. I mean, and then we are in some areas like Slovenia, which has the highest bear density in the world, and that's completely artificial. I mean, it's not natural to have bears 10 times higher than the natural carrying capacity, and it is because, I mean, the productivity is the landscape productivity is so high. They're coming to the villages. The Slovenian forest services, they actually need to feed the bears in the forest so that they don't come to the villages. So you see that even in a European landscape scale, there's so much difference from the prey base, but also how large carnivores are handled.
Cool. So I would interpret this as being sort of optimistic with conditionalities attached to it. Let's get to the really juicy questions now, okay? This is all just been warming up, right, just to get people in the flow. So now we come to that big, the $100 million question. What on earth is coexistence? And how might it look like in the case of large carnivores in Europe? And Luigi I'll save the trouble, and you can specify the species and the context in which you choose to apply, because obviously it depends where you are. Luigi.
Well, coexistence is a very nice word, but I suspect that everybody read in this word anything that they like to read. Let's make an example. In Europe, across Europe, it's relatively easy to bring stakeholders around the table to discuss about, the future of a certain species of large carnivores. And imagine that you have them all around the table, and you try to solve the conflicts, which means you try to design a coexistence, a model for coexistence. When you put this issue on the table, everybody read that in his own way. What is very often missing is a clear definition of the rule of the game. What are we talking about? What is the vision for this coexistence? And I suspect that very often this is missing. The coexistence means compromise. That's the word. It's actually almost a synonym. And a compromise implies that both parties discussing on the use of one resource or one issue are ready to accept a limitation of their wishes just to please the other one. That's compromise. It's what we do every day in our daily life with our partners. We compromise, and otherwise it would be a model that doesn't exist. So in compromising, we accept the possibility of giving up some of our wishes. So it all depends in the end on how much we are ready to tolerate. Tolerance is a word that was raised even by David this morning, and I think it's crucial. In central Italy, for example, where wolves never disappeared, the shepherds are used to have a certain number of sheep lost to wolves and bears. As long as this number is within small numbers, 4, 5, 10, 15 in a year, they tolerate the damage. Nobody complains. And if you poll the attitude of this shepherd toward the wolves, 90% are in favor. Because for them, that loss is minimal. They tolerate that. Now, if you move to northern Italy, where the wolf came back after a century of absence, even one sheep loss is intolerable. And if you go to Alto Adige, which is the province of Bolzano, pretty close to Austria, and Austria is not far from that, they're even worse. They do not accept the idea of setting up mitigation prevention measure, because the only idea to deal with the wolf is intolerable. So everything in the end works with tolerance. Now, tolerance can be educated, but I ask Camilla to support me on this. I think we can work on raising the level of tolerance. Now, just to make sure, I'm not speaking only to raise the tolerance of those who are against large carnivores. I also mean to work on the tolerance of those who think that every wolf is a saint to be defended. Now, we have to teach them to be tolerant that a certain number of wolves could be removed. That's a true compromise, both parties giving up something. I think we have to put this on the table when we get stakeholders around the table, because I think it's really important to define this issue at the beginning of a meeting of all stakeholders, so we all know that we are working toward that result. But I'm asking Camilla's support.
Okay, so Camilla.
Now, what you raise is very important because, I mean, it's hard to imagine a landscape without coexistence, since we've always had the large carnivores in Sweden, even though they have been fewer in numbers. But one challenge that we have seen lately is just that type of group that don't have a will to compromise, and that actually is living on the conflict, because if the conflict disappears, they will not have any legitimacy around the table. So they actually don't want to solve the issue. And that's of course a problem, in particular when you want to set up management that is more adaptive, so that you can try to find new solutions, potentially innovative solutions, to handle the issue. If you always have actors at the table that force you to go to court every time you try to do something to mitigate conflicts. So that's actually one of the challenges. I think that is also forcing those groups that, or the right holders, for example, the indigenous people, but also other stakeholders that actually have a livelihood based on livestock, for example, to become less tolerant. So that's increasing the conflict rather than decreasing it. So what we are trying to do is to find ways to set up these governance solutions or adaptive management solutions, but currently there's also lack of money, for example, and also lack of interest among a lot of stakeholders to actually be part of that in order to try to find ways forward. So coexistence is a very nice idea and something that most people want, but it also takes a lot of effort. And I can't really see it right now, because the conflict spiral has really gone very far.
Okay.
And also, linking back to what you said, Sabrina, is that with the legislation, that we don't have that adaptive capacity in relation to the legislation is a challenge.
Okay. Sabrina?
Yes, I think maybe for the future there will be very different versions of coexistence in Europe. That coexistence will look very different depending on the local situation, the social situation, the cultural situation, how people learned to accept and live with large carnivores. And I think this is something we need to accept, like for the hunting community, for example. When it comes to the lynx, they just want to be included into the monitoring. They want to be included in decision making. For the wolf, maybe they want to play a more active role. They want to feel a certain empowerment, and they don't want that decisions are made in the capitals or are made in Brussels. So yes, if we can find a way to accept different realities of coexistence, I think that could bring, that would be a way forward, that we see different versions out there, and that it's not black and white. It's not that active management would go along with every large carnivore population in Europe, but that if people think this is a way forward to have really an adaptive management, then this should be as well accepted.
Okay, thank you, David.
It's still always a compromise.
Sure.
We assume different results, but it's always a compromise. And that's the concept that has to go through, which is, it appears obvious when you explain it, you know, in words, but actually in practice, the idea of compromising means accepting a limitation of your wishes. It's not easy.
It's become increasingly less popular in modern day politics as well. So, Alex? The Albanian solution.
Exactly, you have the solution right there. So we were hiking once with a very good friend of mine in the northeastern part of the country, and it's beautiful landscapes and small villages and almost a situation that you would find in all over Europe many centuries ago, like small parcels of farmland, people engaging with their livestock, grazing them, being stewards of the landscape in general. And that good friend of mine, after being there, he was from Norway, by the way. After being there for a few days, he said, well, you should turn this thing into an ethnographic museum. That's what he said. And, you know, as an anthropologist and having had training in anthropology, it really struck me, and I said, okay, yeah, we have something that works here. It's, you know, it's a situation where, you know, people coexist with large carnivores, they know how to manage them, and they know how to deal, and all the situation around it. But at the end of the day, we cannot expect that to remain like that for the years to come and the decades to come. Of course, I would like to see it to remain as much of that as it's possible, and to be able to say that, look, if you want to find a coexistence scenario, go to the highlands of Albania or other countries in southeastern Europe, and you would find it. Change is happening rapidly, and these areas are, I said earlier, they're being depopulated massively. People are living together with them. The knowledge and the know-how and the tradition and the knowing how to coexist with large carnivore is leaving. And one would think that because people are leaving, okay, then there is more room for nature. Okay, that shouldn't be such a bad thing. But we find that that's not the case at all, because the people are not just there, you know, using nature or taking resources from nature. They are also there being stewards and protecting nature. What we see is that the moment that the people move out, other very influential, powerful actors move in. You have mining companies moving in, you have logging companies moving in, you have hydropower companies moving in, you have big resorts that want to be built for skiing in southern Europe, by the way, crazy enough. So the people that are there, they're not just there, you know, as a nuisance and as taking land from nature. They're there being the stewards of the landscape. And the moment that they move out, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's better for the large carnivore in particular, or for nature in general. It's what we see is that it's actually worse. So I agree very much with what Luigi said, that it is about finding the compromise, and it is about tolerance, but it's also coexistence. I think it's also inevitably also about managing change, and we know that change is always happening and will always happen. So we have to acknowledge that we don't want to be stuck in a museum scenario where, you know, we want to strictly protect this museum and, you know, preserve it as it is, because, you know, society doesn't work like that, and change is inevitable. So we need to constantly be aware of that and to find solutions depending on these new situations.
Thank you, Alex. Hannes.
Yeah, coexistence, something I really like, and I personally link it up to the idea of sustainable development. It's a holistic, value-based approach where society is asked to negotiate about a state and a future state, and in the light of coexistence with living with large carnivores, it's different stakeholder groups. It's not the carnivores themselves, because they're represented by conservationists. And what I agree is, it's because it's a value-based, anthropogenic, people-centered approach, it's about compromises and negotiation. I also agree and think that it's important to break it down to a scale where stakeholders are affected, like regional scale, or where they can manage challenges. I think it's very much important, if you talk about coexistence, to really carefully look at those stakeholders who are affected, and taking up the example of hunters and livestock keepers, grazing livestock, where I see the biggest challenge for Central Europe living with large carnivores is, what is the contribution of these different stakeholders groups to the society? So livestock keepers for open grasslands, it's one of the highest ecological value for producing animal-friendly meat products and conserving biodiversity. So this is something in cultural, multi-shared landscapes I think no one in Europe, Central Europe, would like to miss. So we have to give livestock keepers with grazing livestock a strong voice and see how we can support them. For hunters, I think it really depends on the region. If we have like cultural, traditional hunting, like in the northern, with the very northern nomadic people in Scandinavia, they somehow coexist with carnivores. They keep their livestock and have found ways how to live with nature. In modern Central Europe, we have different ways of managing wildlife, for example. That's from the perspective of foresters, from the perspective of farmers who lose crops or livestock. And I think it's very important to differentiate between the goals the different stakeholder groups have, and to link it up again to the idea of sustainable development, to question what is the contribution to the society the stakeholders claim. And then, of course, I think it's important to have a value-based approach where stakeholders can put points or express their attitudes and needs, but also to underpin this with quantitative information and evidence to avoid in this kind of dramatic transformation process with lots of politicization, emotions, to avoid fake news and to use science to bring people back on the evidence basis. And this is a dynamic process. It will be subject to negotiation during the next couple of years, maybe forever, and we can't stop.
I think Hollis was just advertising the next panel debate to be downstairs after the coffee break, which he is chairing, which will be dealing with some of these issues. So I think...
I just want to add that when you are around the table and try to discuss a compromise, you know, the discussion can go very nicely and fairly as long as everybody is fair and ready to give up something. The harsher the discussion, the higher is the level of accusation and against each other, and then you see points being raised on how much you contribute to society, you know, or something like that, which are true, extremely true arguments. I myself, in this kind of discussion, I start to be very fair, and as long as the discussion is fair, I maintain fairness. But if I see, you know, people trying to be violent, then I have other arguments, like, you know, you farmers, how much you cost to me every year? Because, you know, every sheep in Europe is subsidized by, you know, 50% by the European Union. So, shut up. Half of your sheep is paid by me. Or hunters, well, we can do without hunters. Why not? And in fact, in Italy, for example, hunters are not against, I don't know a single hunter who would be willing to kill a wolf or a bear, or is not interested in hunting large carnivores, and so on. So it depends on the table, you know, and then at a certain point you can raise some arguments that you would keep low profile, you know, as long as possible.
Okay.
Can I also add I mean, it's often that the table per se doesn't include any mandate. So it's more a show-off, which also means that these arguments often come up. And that because if it actually mattered, the decision that was made around the table, you would be more careful. But a lot of these governance arrangements that has been set up does not entail a true mandate to actually change anything. So that's the step that we need to take, is to be able to actually also trust those who are involved. And by doing that, it would also be more, or it would matter more to the people around the table to actually come up with a compromise.
So actually, you guys have slid over into the next question, which seems to always happen here. That question is built on a premise, right? The coexistence seems to be much more a social issue than an ecological issue in a European context. And we face this kind of balance between balancing this diversity of local situations with the ecology of the species that requires thinking on a large scale. Like, you don't have a local bear population, you know, you don't have a local wolf population, you have continental populations. And you cannot manage landscape like a chessboard with yes, no, bear here, no bear, yes, bear. So how do we balance these scales? How do we give that voice to the locals, which you need for this kind of social aspect of it? But how do we match that with the ecological reality that you do need a certain degree of coordination on regional or even continental scales? So, Camilla, seeing as you were talking, you actually put your foot into it. You walked right into this question, right? So now you can answer it.
Yeah, of course, that's the Nobel Prize question.
That's why we're giving you the opportunity.
Thank you. No, but one challenge in all terms of governance or government is that we have fragmented the decision-making quite a lot. And by working more, for example, on a regional level, defining different scales and where matching the scales to also the societal levels, I mean the political levels or management levels, you could actually decentralize more issues than what we have decentralized today. But it will, of course, still be problematic because these animals require different type of scales. And also, I mean, when our societies are really fragmented also in terms of private ownership and different type of ownership, and we're not thinking in landscapes anymore, for example, or if we ever have. So that's also something that is required in terms of collecting data, for example, to get better data for making decisions. But I think that we are slowly getting there because we are talking more about green corridors or blue corridors and trying to figure out how we can manage social ecological systems instead of just focusing on forests, water, wildlife, and so on. So these ideas are slowly also getting into the authorities' mindset, which is good. And potentially opening up for these type of management or decisions that can be made more holistically.
Okay. Yeah. Sabrina, do you have a magic solution to this?
I wish. No, but I can only reinforce the statement of Camilla that authorities and governments actually do play in that case a really essential role, because we have some local stakeholder platforms where there were actually compromises, and these compromises were found between WWF and the local hunting association, which is something not common. But then in this particular case, the authorities were missing. So I mean, there were nice discussions, and the language was okay, and they worked very hard to find a list of action points. But then the authority was missing all the backup and the making it legit. How do you say it? Making it count also from the government point of view. And then funding is, of course, another issue. Yeah, so if we somehow can, yeah, well, in different national settings involve, make governments or authorities understand that things discussed at local level is really essential.
Okay. Alex?
Yeah, I mean, trying to find the silver bullet here.
There's competition for that Nobel Prize.
Well, I think the answer is that there is no silver bullet, and there is no formula for, you know, achieving coexistence that could be applied everywhere. But definitely, when it comes to some of the things that, you know, I've noted working in the particular setup that the Balkans might be when it comes to large carnivores, is that if something is working well, do not meddle with it. Don't try to fix something that is not broken. And what we are increasingly noticing is that because governmental institutions have been sort of away from nature conservation forever in these countries. I mean, nature conservation has been very low priority for decades, if forever, in many of these countries. Now it's starting to become an agenda and an ethic of governance. And because of that, what they often do is that they look on models that they consider successful, which in the continental scenario, that would be the EU. And then by doing that, they bypass completely the local situations or the need of the locals, and then they engage in some policy making or some legislation making that is completely detached from the needs that are on the local level. And there is the famous example from Croatia that the wolf was a hunted species until 1995, and you know, wolves were doing fine. They were there. There was a healthy population, what one would consider. It was a game species. Hunters were managing it. There were quotas and so on. And then all of a sudden, you know, Croatia, a newly formed state, wanted to look good in the eyes of the international community, aspiring to be a member of the European Union, bam, declares the wolf protected almost overnight because it's in whatever annex of the Habitats Directive, so it needs to be protected. And then a piece of legislation that was made with the purpose of protecting the species resulted in the complete opposite. So wolves started getting killed more and more after that, and it made the situation much worse. So definitely, if there are local mechanisms that work, give power to those mechanisms, keep them going, engage in hearing the other all the time, and people need to feel that they are being heard. And I think if we hear each other more, I think the solution eventually comes.
Okay. Hannes?
Yeah, when thinking about bringing together this mismatch of ecological systems and social stakeholder needs, at least for the case of wolf livestock farmers coexistence in Germany, we have on the one side the monitoring, the ecological side, where the government is monitoring numbers of wolves and setting laws in accordance to the EU Habitat Directive. So I don't question this. This is something our government and European Commission has to deal with. That's for me something I can take as a given fact. On the other hand, I have to translate the consequences of conservation into impact for, in my case, grazing livestock, and see how we can mitigate or minimize conflicts. So as long as there will be no steering vehicle at the side of wolf numbers, I have to focus on this transition process. The number will still increase. We want, as a society, as a German society, we want to have grazing livestock out, not compared with animals kept in stables, because this is something really people appreciate. So subsidies is maybe one thing you criticized, Luigi. I'm with you partly, but in this case, our society wants livestock to keep our cultural landscapes open. And as long as we don't have a solution, we need to support or do everything to support those stakeholders who are mostly affected. And then see, and this was your question, John, how do you envisage the future? I don't know it, but I believe that structural change factors and demographic changes will somehow balance the situation in the future, and governance, good governance, and also adaptation of people and laws will do their other part. And all this together, I think it's very, very important to have this socio-ecological systems approach from an interdisciplinary perspective, but also from a transdisciplinary, where we consider the local regional needs and translate what policymakers could or should do to smoothen this transition process, or to mediate or to moderate coexistence.
Okay, thank you. Luigi, you have some words of wisdom here?
No, certainly, just to clarify what you said, I'm ready to accept if a country democratically decides, to wipe out all the large carnivores. I'm okay. I mean, that's the democratic process. So many idiot decisions are made every day on the basis of that. So one more is not going to change my idea of democracy. The answer to this question, John, is very complicated, but again, it depends on the countries. Take the example of France. France is a top-down country. Everything is decided in Paris. Even the last shepherd down in the south of France, has to accept what comes from Paris through a very, very well-structured process. And in some other countries, the fragmentation in cantons in Switzerland, or the lenders in, all that makes things much more difficult. So in the end, the solution to this question depends on how well structured is the institution, the Republican institution. In Italy, of course, is a disaster because, there is one national law saying something, and then all regions do different things. And even within a region, there are provinces that make their own decision and all that. So this administrative and political fragmentation is actually a nightmare for conservation for management of large carnivores, whatever they are. So for certain areas, I'm very optimistic. For others, I'm pessimistic in answering this question.
Yeah, okay. Good. Thank you. I would like to apologize to the audience because we've actually run out of time. So I cannot let you guys loose on the microphone. But these guys are all around, you know who they are, so you can corner them in the coffee breaks. So just to kind of wrap it up, I guess actually, I almost did ask actually the wrong question at the start about what is this kind of coexistence, because maybe it doesn't exist as a state. Maybe coexistence isn't a thing. Maybe it's more a process, right? And it's a process where we're probably always going to be about 2 or 3 steps behind. In some ways, it actually kind of reminds me of how it is being a parent. Kids are growing, and just when you finally work out how to deal with that baby stage, they've moved up to being toddlers. And they've got like 6 months to try and understand that toddler stage, and then they've moved on. And just when you've got the hang of it, suddenly they're into their teens, and then they're dating, and you've got to buy a shotgun for the boyfriend and stuff. And you never, ever catch up as a parent. You're always 2 or 3 or 5 steps behind. But you're trying your best. You're shepherding the process forward, trying to avoid too many pitfalls. And maybe coexistence is like that. With all this change and this diversity, maybe we shouldn't expect to have the answer, but we maybe just try to steer the process and avoid the worst accidents on the way. So perhaps we have to really reconsider our metaphors here, actually, and start to actually maybe ask the questions in different ways. So that's my kind of attempt to summarize. But I'd like to thank the audience for being patient. And again, I apologize that you didn't get the microphone. And thank you to the panel for providing some very good and diverse insights. So thank you very much. Thank you all.